Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is the Utah Historical Society's Perspective Speaker Series. We're joined by Amy Tanner Thiriot today, and she's an independent historian and adjunct university instructor whose work combines genealogical and historical research to tell the untold stories of the past. She's the recent author of Slavery in Zion, a documentary and genealogical history of Black lives and Black servitude in Utah Territory, 1847 to 1862, and this was published by the University of Utah Press. She's now working on a series of biographies of the early women of Washington County, Utah. And Amy's depth of research expertise and careful writing and research make her somebody who really knows a lot about what she's speaking about. And I'm very excited to hear from her. My name is Catherine Kitterman. I'm the manager of the Women's History Initiative at the Utah Historical Society. We're very glad to be joined by Amy today to learn about this important topic in Utah history. As a reminder, this meeting is being recorded, so we have a Q&A box down at the bottom. If you would like to ask a question to Amy about her presentation, or if something comes up as she's speaking, please drop your questions there, and I'll moderate that at the end of her time. So, Amy, I think we're ready to hear from you.
Thank you. It'll take me a second to get my slides up. One moment. There, and does that look right? Okay, thank you, Catherine. Well, thank you to the Utah State Historical Society for arranging this hour together, and especially to Catherine and Wendy for helping facilitate it. I appreciate all of you being with us today to help remember the enslaved Black pioneers of Utah Territory. As Catherine mentioned, we'll have time for questions afterward. To start, the book Slavery in Zion uses an image throughout called the Sankofa. The symbol is a bird facing forward but turning backward to fetch memories, represented by an egg or a gourd. Sankofa is an Akan funerary symbol representing memory and is often associated with a proverb. It is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten. The story of the enslaved in Utah Territory is a story that has often been told badly, if at all. As I mentioned in the introduction to my book, I've relied on the work of many dedicated family, community, and academic historians who lovingly and carefully compiled information over the years. However, much of the story was told by descendants of the people who took the enslaved pioneers to Utah Territory. After the Civil War, legends arose in Utah and elsewhere about the supposedly affectionate relationship between enslaved people and their enslavers. Descendants of enslavers conveniently forgot that slavery was kept operational in the US only by violence, threats, and family separations. Descendants of Utah enslavers ignored this history of violence and family separations and created fictional or fictionalized accounts that claimed that the enslaved left the South of their own free will and accompanied their enslavers to Utah Territory out of love and affection. This story is told over and over again in family and community accounts. When you start to dig into the records, however, the story is much different. We have very few words from the enslaved pioneers, but when we do have any reliable records of their words, they almost always spoke of freedom. John Burton spoke of crossing the River Jordan, a symbol of freedom. Green Flake spoke of what he would do when he was freed. Theophilus presented forged freedom papers to Brigham Young. Jerry told Brigham Young that he was a free man. Alexander and Marinda Bankhead told a reporter about the joy that was on the faces of all the slaves when they learned they were free. This is the story that has been forgotten and why a community of historians and genealogists are working to set these stories straight. Here's one example of how the story needs to be set straight. The Brigham Young Monument by Temple Square in Salt Lake City was created in 1897 for the 50th anniversary of the first Mormon pioneer company to enter the Salt Lake Valley. The monument showed the 3 enslaved men in the first pioneer company as colored servants. The first, Green Flake, traveled from his home in Idaho to attend the celebrations and would have seen his name on the new monument. As you can see here, they are separated from the rest of the pioneers by a color line and called colored servants. The term servant originally meant an indentured servant or a person working in contracted labor. By the 19th century, however, many Southerners had adapted the term to mean enslaved people. They used the term not to designate the legal class of these people, but to state their own preferred social class. The term was an effort to cover the grim stories of human trafficking and forced labor with a veneer of gentility. Although the monument says servants, all three men were enslaved rather than paid or indentured servants. Another detail to notice on the monument, Green Flake is listed correctly by the correct name, but the other two men are listed with their enslavers' family names rather than their own family names. The names that should be on the monument are Hark Wales and Oscar Smith. As you can see here, the names are correct on the new Black Pioneer Monument at This Is the Place Heritage Park in Salt Lake City. If you haven't had an opportunity to see the monument yet, it's outside the park, so you can just drive up to the park and walk over to the main Pioneer Monument and then over to the Black Pioneer Monument to see that beautiful new creation. Here's a second example of how the story of the Black pioneers was subsequently hidden or mistold. The picture shown here was used in a book called Charities and Philanthropies, Women's Work in Utah by Emmeline B. Wells. The book includes a picture of a Relief Society hall in downtown Salt Lake City. The Relief Society was a women's organization founded by members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1842. Local chapters supported charity and religious work throughout the church. If you look closely at the picture from the book, to the left, you can see three Black children. In the back center is a Black woman, and to the right is a Black man. Historian Tanya Ryder and I have discussed this picture at length. Our best guess is that the woman in the middle is either Jane Manning James, shown to the left, or her daughter-in-law, Mary Perkins James, shown to the right. The man on the right in the picture is either Frank Perkins or Sylvester James. Jane and Sylvester were pioneers of 1847, and Frank and Mary were pioneers of 1849. The book's editor, Emmeline B. Wells, would have known both families. 50 years later, in 1942, the Relief Society published a book celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Relief Society. The general president of the Relief Society was Amy Brown Lyman, a daughter of a Utah enslaver. I haven't seen any explanations about what went into the creation of the 1942 book, but the Relief Society General Board decided to reuse the picture of the Relief Society Hall from the previous book. Perhaps documentation exists somewhere to explain why the editors used primitive photo editing to replace each Black face in the photograph with a white face. The pictures will be small on your screens, but hopefully you can see how the editors removed each Black person from the photo, removing either Jane or Mary and their family members from the story. This is a rather straightforward and visual example of how history has so often been whitewashed. Other efforts include the introduction of lost cause mythology into family and community histories. Lost cause mythology was the successful propaganda effort by former Confederates after the Civil War. They argued that their efforts to preserve slavery were just and righteous, and that enslaved people benefited from the system of slavery. This mythology showed up in books and movies like Gone with the Wind. It shows up in many family histories that discuss slavery in Utah Territory. It shows up in Washington County, Utah, called Utah's Dixie, with their ahistorical 20th century appropriation of Confederate symbols. So it's become pervasive in places you wouldn't even expect. This is all a suggestion of the need to be careful about whose version of the story we use to retell the story of slavery in Utah Territory. Before I talk more about the Black pioneers, I'll provide a very brief introduction to slavery in the American West. After that, I'll show you pictures of important historical documents and accompany each with a story of the Black pioneers. But before turning to the history, this slide shows a list of all the documented enslaved African-American settlers of Utah Territory. As you look through the list, you can see that we don't know all their names. I could never find the names of the brother and sister in the McCown household, for example. But with the work of many historians, community historians, genealogists, and descendants of the enslaved or their enslavers, these are the names that we know as of today. 4 of the names are new as of last December. These are Mary Elmira Bankhead Johnson, Mary Bankhead Browning, Betty Stone, and Emma Stone Pullum. Their names didn't make it into the book, but the research and some of the answers keep coming. Records of slavery are rarely good enough to be able to complete genealogies of any of these people. We don't know where many of these people were born, and where far too many of them died and were buried. There are just a very few cases where we didn't know the names of their parents. Each one of the Black pioneers had to leave family and friends in the South when they left for Utah Territory. When they left, they didn't know if they would ever see their family members again. They didn't know if they would ever know where they were buried, any of those questions. They left without any means to communicate. In some cases, we can now use DNA to make connections. Through DNA research, descendants of some of the people shown on this slide have been able to reconnect with relatives in the South or the Midwest. Genealogy can be a powerful force to help heal generational wounds, even wounds we might not have known we were carrying. Whole books have been written about the following history or are in the process of being written. I'm going to summarize it in just a couple of minutes, so please don't be concerned if I simplify something too much. In order to leave time for the stories, this will be a very quick look at the history. As the population of the US moved westward, the United States created new states and territories. By the middle of the 19th century, the country was divided between slave and free states, so each new state or territory could disrupt the balance of power in Washington, D.C. The territory of Kansas became a bloody battleground over slavery. The lands west of Kansas entered the Union in the Compromise of 1850, California as a free state, Utah and New Mexico territories with popular sovereignty or the right to decide whether to become free or slave territories. So as the Latter-day Saint pioneers moved west, we're looking at California, New Mexico territory, which included Arizona, Utah territory, which included Nevada, Washington territory, and Oregon territory. Utah and New Mexico territories both desired statehood, and both knew that they were balancing on the edge of a political sword. Both enacted laws allowing indentured servitude or slavery, while telling powerful Northerners that few slaves lived within their borders, and they did not plan to become slave states. California became a free state, but that does not mean there were no enslaved people there. Many Southerners took enslaved people with them to settle farms, ranches, or work the gold fields. Black people were legally bought and sold in California through 1864. New Mexico acted under the influence of its slave-owning governor, Abraham Rancher, to enact a harsh slave code that ensured the bondage of perhaps a dozen enslaved people. Utah had a larger enslaved population. There were eventually around 100 total enslaved African Americans in the territory, although never more than about 50 at a time, and usually around 30. Most of the enslaved were servants or farm workers in the households of Latter-day Saint converts from the South. Some were taken to the territory by merchants or federal territorial officials, and some were enslaved by US Army officers who traveled to Utah during military expeditions. Brigham Young told a newspaper editor, Horace Greeley, that although they would obey US slave law, the territory consisted of small irrigated farms and was not profitable for slavery. Utah decided to come down on the side of being a slave territory, but with a number of caveats. Instead of basing its law on the slave codes of the South, like New Mexico did, Utah modeled its slave law after the gradual emancipation laws of the Northeast or the Midwest. The act was kind of a legal mess. I mean, honestly, they didn't know what they were doing, but it attempted to create a form of contract labor rather than chattel slavery. The act allowed those taking enslaved people into the territory to continue to profit from their labor. Using their labor under the provisions of the act required the permission of the probate judge. Enslavers had to educate enslaved children in their household, and the enslaved had to approve of any sale of their labor, along with other provisions. It was a strange piece of legislation. Watch for a forthcoming book about the legal situation in Utah from Paul Reeve, Christopher Rich, and Legene Carruth. That will be out soon. For the most part, everyone in Utah ignored an act in relation to service. Alexander Bankhead, who was held in slavery in the Salt Lake Valley, he lived in Draper, said, "Our lives were far from being happy, and many of us were subjected to the same treatment that was accorded the plantation Negroes of the South." The story of African-American slavery in the American West is the story of hundreds of enslaved peoples, not millions, as in the American South. These are the numbers reported in the census slave schedules. The numbers in the West, you can see 26 reported in 1850 and 29 in 1860 are an undercount. Slave schedules were only taken in part of Utah territory in 1850 and 1860, and were not taken in California or other Western states. So the presence of other enslaved people has to be documented through other means. And here, of course, I am only talking about African-American slavery, not Indian slavery, which Paul, Christopher, and Legene will address in their upcoming book. Based on the historical records, when you supplement the census records with other records, the numbers in the West should be in the hundreds in 1850, including several hundred in California, and somewhat lower in 1860. The majority of enslaved Black people taken to Utah territory were there by 1851. Except for Army officers and Missouri merchants, very few Southerners took enslaved people to Utah after 1851. The 1850 census was taken in the spring of 1851 in Utah territory. These are the numbers by county. You can see the Perkins and Camp households in Davis County, the Flake, Bankhead, Brown, and Smoot households in Great Salt Lake County, the Red household in Utah County, John Burton in Iron County down in the south, and several Mississippi households on their way to California who were enumerated in Utah County before they left to cross the Mojave Desert to San Bernardino. I have been able to document between 54 and 57 enslaved Black pioneers in the territory in the spring of 1851. About a decade later, the 1860 census only enumerated 2 counties, Davis and Salt Lake, but there is good reason to believe there were enslaved people in Cache, Utah, and Iron counties. So in total, I documented between 33 and 35 enslaved Black people that year. And you can see the households named there. Although this is not a huge story by the numbers, especially compared to the millions held in bondage in the South, it was a huge story for every person, every household, every institution involved in slavery in Utah territory. On June 19th, 1862, Congress ended slavery in the United States territories. Abraham Lincoln signed the bill the next day. The records are not definitive, but it appears that some of the enslaved in the West may not have known they were free until the end of the Civil War. That's the family histories from the descendants of the enslavers either say that they were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation the next year, which is not the case, or at the end of the war. So we have concluded that enslavers probably continued to take the labor of their enslaved people through 1865, but we do not know for sure. And we, when I say we, that's not the royal we, I mean the different historians working on the subject right now. Here's a quick review of the timeline. In the 1830s, Latter-day Saint missionaries began preaching in the South. They baptized both enslavers and a small number of enslaved people. Most of the white Southern converts were small farmers. Some, including the Bankheads and Crosbys, were children of plantation owners, but small farmers themselves. Southern converts joined the Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo, Illinois, with a small number of enslaved people. They then moved westward with the Latter-day Saint migration. There were a few enslaved people at the refugee camp at winter quarters, including Jacob, who died there, John Burton, Green Flake, Elizabeth Flake, and a few others. In 1846 and 1847, Southern households began moving westward. In 1850, Utah became a territory with self-determination about slavery. A couple of years later, after many enslaved people were taken out of the territory, mostly to California, some back to Mississippi, Utah Territory created an act in relation to service. 10 years later, Congress ended slavery in the territories. Here are the documentable migration and childbirth numbers. As I said, most of the migration happened by 1851. This chart does not include enslaved people in the territory with army officers, merchants, and government appointees, but it's just a small number, additional number, mostly in the mid to late 1850s. So moving on to the documents, you can see here an image of a wagon roster from a group of Mississippi converts moving west in 1848. As you can see, looking at the compiled list, the members of each household were numbered instead of named. This is so unfortunate since we don't know the names of the enslaved brother and sister in the McCown household, and we're not entirely sure who crossed the plains in the Bankhead household. The highlighted entry shows John and Elizabeth Crosby Brown traveling west with a girl named Betsy. John and Elizabeth sold the enslaved people she inherited from her father, but she must have argued that she needed household help because her family later said that her husband, John Brown, purchased Betsy in St. Louis as they moved across the country. Betsy was enslaved in the Brown household for a number of years. They might have rented her out to help supplement the family income. After Betsy was freed, she married John Flewellen, who had served in the Civil War. This picture shows her with her only surviving child, Kate Flewellen Oglesby. We don't know what Betsy's life was like in her later years. She lived widowed for many years, but she died around 1900 in the Utah State Hospital in Provo. Although the previous wagon roster only showed numbers, some of the people in that company appeared in a separate roster. This shows the household of Robert and Rebecca Dorn Smith, with most of the enslaved people they took to Utah. Whoever made the list left off one of the girls named Anne. Both Biddy and Hannah had daughters named Anne, but the clerk must have thought that was a duplicate and only included one of them. Randy on the top tried to free himself in Utah. We don't know what happened to him after that. He disappears from the records. Biddy, and 2 spaces down, you can see Hannah, and their children ended up in California. It's been a delight over the past several years to interact with one of Hannah's descendants. She is very active in keeping her family's heritage alive in the Inland Empire. So the highlighted names show Biddy Mason and her daughter Ellen. Biddy, on the left, was a nurse. She used her earnings to invest heavily in real estate, and she became very well-to-do. She was one of the wealthiest women in California. Her daughters inherited her estate and helped create a real estate empire which lasted until the Great Depression. Ellen is on the right. I'll show you another picture of her later. As I mentioned, the 1850 US Census for Utah Territory was taken not in 1850, but in the spring of 1851. This shows the draft copy of the slave schedule. There was an official copy that went to Washington, D.C., and then the draft copy was kept in Utah and is in the collections of the Church History Library in Salt Lake City. The draft copy shows on this page 26 enslaved people being taken to California. The first person on the list is Green Flake, highlighted in yellow. He did not actually make it to California. Neither did Violet or Rose, also shown highlighted. This is the draft copy of the same year slave schedule for Salt Lake County. It shows Green a second time. This time it shows him not in the possession of Agnes Flake, but in the possession of Brigham Young. Finally, here's the part of the census showing the free population of Salt Lake County. It shows Green, Violet, and Rose living together. Violet and Rose had arrived in Utah in 1848 with the Crosby household. All three were initially shown as going to California, as you just saw, but all three remained in the Salt Lake Valley. So what explains these contradictory records? Why does Green show up 3 times? Why do Rose and Violet show up twice? Many of the Mississippi converts did not like the climate in Utah. It was harsher than they were used to, and many of their cattle were dying over the winter. So they decided to move to California. The Crosbys from Mississippi planned to go to California, but the Bankhead brothers from Alabama planned to stay in Utah. With the household splitting up, it would split up several new enslaved families. After they arrived in Utah, Hark Wales had married Nancy Bankhead, and they began to have a family, and other families were likewise going to be split up. Green Flake and Hark Wales went to Brigham Young for his help to keep their families together. Brigham Young told the Crosbys and the Bankheads, their extended families, that they needed to switch some people around to preserve the greatest number of families. Unfortunately, Hark, the enslavers were not able to make all the arrangements to do that. They refused. And he had to go to California, leaving behind his pregnant wife, Nancy, and her 3 sons. To solve an impasse in these negotiations, Brigham Young hired Green Flake for a yoke of oxen, which was a good price for hiring an enslaved man for a year. So Green, Violet, and Rose, as you saw from the census records, remained in Utah. An unnamed man from the Bankhead household instead drove Agnes Flake and her children to California. The Bankheads and the Crosbys were not happy with the new arrangements. After Green worked for Brigham Young for about a year, he was freed and given land in Union Fort, where he and his family and several other Black families lived for many decades. Many of their descendants still live in Utah or the surrounding states. By the 1880s, Green Flake was well known in the region. He regularly spoke at Pioneer Day celebrations. The son of his former enslavers wrote to a historian in the 1890s and tried to explain why Green had left his mother's household. The son had been a child at the time when these events occurred and was orphaned not long afterward. And so he did not have an accurate memory of the time. When he thought back, he decided his mother had given Green to Brigham Young as tithing. That was definitely not the case. We have just enough records from various participants, including his own mother, that we have a good idea what happened, the attempt to preserve families, and it wasn't what the Flake son remembered many years afterwards. So again, as I said, we do need to be careful about whose account we believe, look at when they were creating the record and what knowledge they would have had of the original events, and if there were original records from the time, as we actually did have. This is a statue of Green Flake at the new monument this is the Place Heritage Park. The statue is next to the statues of Hark Wales and Oscar Smith, and also next to a statue of Jane Manning James, a free Black woman from Connecticut, who crossed the plains in a later 1847 pioneer company. You saw her picture earlier. She may have been one of the women in the Relief Society Hall picture. Sometime after he was freed, Green learned to read and write. He wrote his own entry in the Book of the Pioneers in 1897. He recorded that he lived on Cottonwood, Utah for 40 years, but was currently living in Grayslake, Idaho. He reported that he was born January 6, 1828 in North Carolina near Wadesboro, Anson County. Below this clip, he shared some memories of when he crossed the plains in 1847. He spoke of buffalo and interactions with American Indians as he went across the plains. Here's another entry from the draft copy of the 1850 slave schedule. This shows the household of John Hardison Red. He and his wife took 5 enslaved people and 1 indentured servant to Utah. You can see there the names of Venice, Cheney, Luke, Marinda, Amy, and Sam Franklin, who, as it says, would be free when 21. That meant he was indentured and not enslaved. This picture, this very beautiful picture, was recently discovered in the George Anderson Photography Collection by historian Tanya Ryder. The Anderson Photography Collection is held at the L. Tom Perry Special Collections at BYU. This is a group photo of the Jesse Holt family. Can you tell by looking at this group photo which of these people had been enslaved in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Utah. One of the people stands out. Off to the right is Miranda Caroline Red Bankhead. Daughters of Utah Pioneers put a similar picture of her, a very poor quality picture of her, into their booklet, The Story of the Negro Pioneer, which confirmed this identification. You can see several clues about her relationship to the Holt family, who were close relatives of her former enslavers, the Reds. Not only is she standing off to the side, she's wearing an apron, which is unusual in any of the pictures in the Anderson photo collection, which I assume showed that she was in service there. Miranda lived in Spanish Fork and other towns in Utah County all the years after she was freed. She and other members of the Red household who were enslaved there in Utah County were freed by the Red family in 1858 or 1859, ahead of when Congress freed the slaves in the territories. Miranda died of breast cancer after the turn of the century and is buried in the Spanish Fork Cemetery with her husband, Alexander. In 1899, journalist Julius Taylor traveled from Salt Lake City down to Spanish Fork to visit Miranda and Alexander. They told him some of their memories of slavery in Utah, about their lives in the South, and a few more recent events in their lives. Although the interview is short, it's a treasure. The next record to look at is the 1860 slave schedule for Salt Lake and Davis counties. The schedule on the left shows Southerners, both Latter-day Saints and merchants from out of state. And the slave schedule, as many of you probably know, was a separate schedule created and attached to the regular census schedules. The schedule on the right shows Davis County with the large Perkins household in Bountiful. You saw earlier the picture of Mary Perkins James. She could have been one of she could have been the woman in the 15th Ward Relief Society Hall picture. And that shows her still living as an enslaved girl in Bountiful, Utah. This time, the names were not recorded in the slave schedule. It took a lot of work over many years to confirm the identities of everyone on the slave schedule. And as you can see, there are two gaps right there. Two individuals are still unknown in the Box and Whitmore households. If you follow the Slavery in Zion Facebook page, you may have seen my notes that this past December, I was able to identify the woman and infant on lines 6 and 7, Betty Stone and Emma Stone Pullum. Emma's sons were baseball players in Kansas City and participated in the precursor to the Negro Leagues. So that was an enjoyable piece of research to figure out what happened to that woman and her baby and how they moved forward in American history. From these 19 people listed as enslaved in Salt Lake County in 1860, I'd like to highlight the women on lines 9 and 10, sisters Caroline and Tampion. Caroline and Tampion Hoye or Hui were the daughters of Hagar and Nathan. Their parents' names were recorded on Caroline's death certificate by a friend. Around 1850, the two girls were inherited by David and Doretha Lewis, who had survived the Hans Mill massacre several years before. We don't know if Caroline and Tampion's parents were still alive when the Lewises took the two girls, ages 9 and 6, from Kentucky to Utah. No one involved left a record of what was undoubtedly a painful scene. The record shown here is from the Salt Lake County Probate Court. It shows widow Doretha Lewis going to court to register Caroline and Tampion before she sold them to Thomas S. Williams. Lewis and Williams and the probate court judge were kind of respecting the provisions of an act in relation to service, but there's no indication that Judge Elias Smith interviewed Caroline or Tampion, as the law stated he must, to make sure they were okay with being sold to Tom Williams. After Williams was murdered in 1859, his widows hired out Tampion or Caroline to help support their household. We unfortunately don't have pictures of either of the sisters or their families. but they were longtime residents of Salt Lake City and Ogden. Tampion's husband was an important civil rights activist. Tampion and her husband named each of their children after important abolitionists. Again, their words, when we have them, even if it was in the naming of their children, were about freedom. Both sisters and their husbands are buried in unmarked graves. Caroline is buried in the Ogden City Cemetery, shown in a spot to the left, and Tampion is buried in the Mount Olivet Cemetery, shown to the right. Their graves do need to be marked, and I hope families and organizations will do so. If you are interested, have any interest in helping mark one of the many unmarked graves of the enslaved Black pioneers, please realize that it's not always straightforward to know what is and is not appropriate for a grave marker. I would be happy to provide advice if anyone has an interest in doing that, or a family organization is interested in marking a grave. And we can work together with Black heritage organizations, including one called Sema Hadithi, an organization that's doing much good in Utah right now. As far as was possible, I traced Southern origins. It was not always possible. The courthouse that held the estate of the Bankhead brothers' father, that would have listed many of the enslaved people they took to Utah, burned in the 1880s. There are many instances where records were not kept. And there are not as many courthouse burnings as people might suspect, but that does prevent some research. That said, there are still many more records than most people realize. As I trace families back into the South, Latter-day Saint enslaving families back into the South, I can see in many cases where they stopped knowing where to look for records when there were still many records available. Census and tax records in the South reported enslaved people as numbers, so they're most useful to create timelines and trace movements of enslaved people into and out of a household. Estate settlements, on the other hand, almost always name enslaved people, so they're more useful overall, although they rarely show the constitution or the makeup of enslaved families. The bill of sale on this slide shows William Crosby purchasing grief embers from John Crosby's estate. When William Crosby bought grief early in 1843, how could either of them possibly have imagined that within a decade, they would have left Mississippi, first for Utah, then California? Grief Embers and his brother Toby Embers crossed the plains to Utah in 1848. Homer Duncan told a little story that involved the two men. He recalled encountering a bear in the woods, running into a tree in his panic and knocking himself out. A little dog, he said, belonging to my third great grandfather, Sidney Tanner, distracted the bear long enough for Homer Duncan to come to regain consciousness, at which point he said he came across two Negroes who belonged to the company, and they had their guns well loaded. He borrowed a gun from either Grief or Toby and killed the bear. I assume all of them would have helped in converting that bear into food if they were to do so. Grief and Toby Embers were indentured under Indiana law, but unfortunately they were taken to Mississippi and always treated as enslaved men until they were in California later. When a person might wonder if they and other enslaved people traveled in chains, you might have the image of slave coffles from the Old South. This was not the case with the households moving west. The enslaved adults were driving and teenagers were driving wagons, caring for livestock and hunting for food. They were not literally in chains, but they had little control over the circumstances of their lives. Oscar Smith, one of the men in the new Black Pioneer Monument at This Is the Place, was in the first Mormon Pioneer Company of 1847, as I mentioned. Greenflake's family told a story that Oscar tried to free himself in Mississippi, but he was caught in the attempt and injured so badly that he was maimed for the rest of his life. Family separations is one of the untold stories We do not know anything about any family members' grief. Toby or Oscar had to leave in Mississippi. So many of the difficulties and tragedies of their lives remain untold and almost unimaginable. We can only get a sense of their lives by reading historical slave narratives from other people in the South. When the Mississippi families went to California, they helped establish a settlement called San Bernardino. Latter-day Saint settlers built a fort. This image is based on a sketch of the fort created several decades later by a historian. If you look at the picture of the fort, there's an extension down to the bottom right. That was the slave quarters. That was where Grief, Toby, Oscar, and others lived. In 1867, after the Civil War, and 11 years after he was freed by a Los Angeles judge, Grief Embers traveled from California back to Mississippi. In Mississippi, he met Latter-day Saint missionary John Brown, the son-in-law of his former enslavers. John Brown wrote, "Here I met a colored man named Grief. He once belonged to Mother Crosby." Brown continued, "He was glad to see me. He is the only colored man I met in this vicinity. When the slaves were emancipated, they left the plantations and went to the cities and towns and along the railroads." Grief left no record of his trip. We only know about it from John Brown. So John Brown's account leaves us with the wistful image of Grief looking for his loved ones in the South and probably never finding them before he had to return to California. I'm sorry if I get emotional with some of these stories. Sometimes we can find traces of stories in legal records. In 1852, Williams and Diana Camp went to Mississippi to gather an inheritance from her father's estate. They returned from Utah back to Mississippi. Before they left, they hired out their enslaved man, Daniel, so the funds from hiring him out could support their children who remained in Salt Lake City. Diana inherited several people from her father's estate, along with other property. Williams and Diana Camp sold a couple of these people and then purchased a woman named Carolina. They returned to Utah with Carolina, Isaac, and Shepard. In 1856, their daughter Ellen and her husband Thomas Lacey Greer were planning to move to Texas. The Greers were going to take the Camps and all their enslaved people with them from Utah to Texas. Again, they didn't like the climate in Utah. Many of their cattle had died just like the cattle of the Mississippi Saints a few years earlier. Daniel, however, did not want to leave Salt Lake City and be taken to Texas, so he ran away. There's only one recorded instance of a slave patrol in Utah. After Daniel ran away so he couldn't be taken back into slavery, 4 Southerners hunted him down. Slave patrols were common in the South, but the residents of Salt Lake City were horrified. Bishop Edwin D. Woolley of Salt Lake City 13th Ward had the 4 men arrested and charged with kidnapping. We don't have a picture of Dan, but this is a rogues gallery of 3 of the 4 men in the ad hoc slave patrol. To the left, Williams Camp, Stephen Decatur Greer, and Americus Vespucius Greer. There's no known picture of the 4th member of the patrol. His name was Madison Foster. The judge ended up dismissing the case for lack of evidence, but Dan actually did remain in Utah. The last time we have been able to find him in a record is the 1860 slave schedule. But there are some landforms in rural Rich County, Utah that might be named after him. So that's a hint that he might have been one of the famed Black cowboys of the American West and died in a rural area of the state. There aren't many pictures of the Black pioneers, but we do have a few, as you've seen throughout. Here are some of them, including some you've already seen in the presentation. To the top left is Marinda Red Bankhead, a longtime resident of Spanish Fork. Next is Mary Perkins James, the daughter-in-law of Jane Manning James. Last is Benjamin Perkins. Benjamin told a reporter he was descended from the kings of Santo Domingo. The reporter thought Benjamin's claim was so funny that he put it in the newspaper. Whatever the reporter thought about the claim, he helped preserve a rare memory that Benjamin's family had come from the Caribbean before being taken to the US. That was a common route for enslaved people being taken into the States. To the bottom left is Ellen Mason Huddleston, Biddy Mason's daughter. Earlier this hour, you saw a picture of her in her older years wearing glasses. Next is an engraving of Green Flake from the Salt Lake Tribune in 1897. Green is the subject of a recent film by Mally Bonner. Just in case you missed the film, do look it up. Last is a picture of Elizabeth Flake Rowan, courtesy of her granddaughter, Alice Black, and the San Bernardino Historical Society. Elizabeth and Green were probably brother and sister. The two of them showed up together in a North Carolina will. In the 1880s, Elizabeth and her daughter traveled from their home in San Bernardino to Salt Lake City to visit friends and relatives and stayed with Green's family. For far too long, so much of this history was left to people who had incentives to get it wrong. It has taken a lot of work to sort through the records, figure out what is myth and what was factual about their experiences. The most important record we have is their own words, then followed by records created by people who interacted with them. When their words fail, we can turn to slave narratives and histories of slavery to get a better sense of their lives. When questions arise about their heritage or the marking of their graves, it's always appropriate to work with African American heritage organizations, or especially if we know of any descendants, to work with their descendants and have them speak for them. Above all, when we think about the enslaved pioneers, we can remember that when we do have records of their words were about freedom. They prized freedom and they prized the ability to remain with their families. Thank you for being here today to help remember the enslaved pioneers, and please don't hesitate to contact me or ask questions here, or contact me through the Slavery in Zion Facebook page with questions, or if you have additional information. Everybody involved in researching this story are so interested to learn if families have plantation records, especially, that we were not able to find in our researches. So once more, thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. We really appreciate your careful research and your thoughtful presentation. I know it's given us a lot to think about. And we do have a few questions that have already come in, and I'm just going to give another reminder to folks that if you have questions you'd like Amy to address, to pop them into that Q&A button that's down below at the bottom of the screen. The first question that we had, this was from Mally Bonner, who you mentioned, Amy. This is about the Green Flake story, saying that Brigham paid the flakes with oxen for Green's labor. Is that what some consider to be tithing? I think he's talking about that misconception or mismemory of the son.
In my research, I read as many tithing records from the early church as I could. I read through, hundreds, thousands of pages of records looking for any hint of tithing payments. What I found is that the Southern enslavers did not like to let the labor of their enslaved people out of their own hands. Agnes Flake leaving Green with Brigham Young was very much an exception. She was not happy about it. She wrote to him from California and tried to have Brigham Young sell him. And Brigham Young just sidestepped the issue. He wasn't going to get involved in that. Green was free by that time under the provisions of an act in relation to service. So was that tithing? No. I have traced the Flake family finances and all of their tithing payments that I've been able to find, and there was no tithing that she could have needed to pay that would have been anything close to the amount that Green was worth. She was not expected to pay any tithing at all as a widow. The church was unlikely, except in, with her asking specifically to be able to pay tithing, to actually accept tithing from her. She was an impoverished widow. She did not have her husband there anymore to help take care of her. And one very important point that's even more important than any of those is that under the provisions of Southern slave law, which was used in Utah Territory, as a matter of fact, she did not have the ability to have Green leave her husband's estate. Green belonged to her husband's estate, she could not donate or sell him without the approval of a court. So she could rent his labor to help provide for her family. She could not sell or donate him. And she was working in concert with the other Southern slavers. The Crosbys and the Bankheads were involved and would not have let her do something to injure her children's prospects. So yes.
Thank you. We had a couple questions about the intricacies of that story, and I think you've answered them there. We do have a comment here from Robert Birch at Samahadithi, who you mentioned earlier. I'm just noting to folks that the Samahadithi Foundation is prepared to help where we can to get markers placed for unmarked graves. This is a project they've worked on for several years and look forward to working with interested parties to get more done. So reaching out to Amy and to Samahadithi, Robert and Alice Birch, it's a good way to start there. So thank you, Robert, for adding that. We have a couple questions here, Amy, and I'm going to start with one of them here. Jennifer Ortiz of State History has said, you've mentioned that there are a few additional names that you've been able to add to the list of the enslaved since you published your book. Could you speak to current efforts underway that are continuing to document the enslaved in Utah?
I am continue to work in concert, but just casually now that the book is published, with other researchers. I mentioned, for example, Tanya Ryder. We continue to work on various issues as they come up. There is an employee, I don't know if I should name her, at the church history department, who continues to, she's working diligently on the history of the Black pioneers and will send me information as she finds it or ask questions when something comes up and she doesn't, understand the context for a record. So most of now that my book's finished, most of these efforts are more casual and just happening as things show up. Samahadithi, of course, is doing magnificent work, remembering the pioneers and Black residents of Utah over the years.
Thank you, Amy. This is, as I think we've all seen, this is a monumental effort, and I can see so many hours of research and searching that has been involved here. And we have many other questions coming in, and I'm picking a few here. One question came in about your process in trying to identify the individuals in that Relief Society Hall photo that you showed at the beginning of your presentation.
How to identify those individuals. The first thing we checked, of course, was whether there's an original version of that picture available anywhere. We unfortunately could not find that the original is in existence. And we have not gone so far as to figure out, which likely decade or half decade or even year that would be because of what the people were wearing. But based on the approximate age of when the Relief Society Hall was built, and when that picture would be taken, are there trees in the background? Can you tell approximately what year? There was not a very large Black population in Utah in the 1860s, 1870s, very small until starting into the 1880s. So the possible people in that picture were very few. It was either Mary and her family or James and her family. And, if we knew the exact year of the picture, we'd be able to tell who those little boys were. But as such, it's just, it's either, this family or that family, and these people are that people.
That makes sense. That was really interesting to me to see those two pictures juxtaposed. And I've seen that picture many times before and never had noticed some of the things you pointed out. Thank you. We've got other comments here again, thanking you for your vulnerability, saying these stories are powerful and important, and we're very glad that you and others like Samahadithi are working to excavate this history. So thank you for that. There's a couple of other questions here. We will, as a reminder to everybody, the link will be set up. So this is being recorded and this will be available on our YouTube page. So you can follow the Utah Historical Society, Utah State History Facebook page, and other places to see when that's available. I'm sure Amy will share the link as well on her Slavery in Zion Facebook page, so you can watch this at a later date as well. We have one question here, a quicker one, and then we'll get into a little longer one. But the question here is saying, so thorough and moving, thank you. Why was green flake often listed as yellow? I think there was that designation on a line that was highlighted in one of the records that you had shared.
Yes, when he was living with Brigham Young, he was listed as yellow. And I'll try to answer this briefly. I could answer this at length. But the census was being used in the 19th century to create racial categories. In Utah specifically, yellow was not a actual census, recommended census category, but the Utah census takers used that to say that they were mixed race heritage, you know, had some evidence of European ancestry as well as African ancestry. If you look at, a photograph of Green Flake from later in his life, I wouldn't put him in the same category as you'd put the enslaved women and girls in the Red household, who were, some of them, could have almost passed as white.
Thank you.
But somebody made that decision to list him as mixed race.
And again, just knowing that those records, who they were created by, helps to answer that. Thank you for pointing that out. We have a great question here about saying, again, thank you for your presentation and thoughtful research, but about having more open conversations about slavery in Utah with loved ones. They're asking if there are any beginner resources you would suggest drawing from or sharing with others and having those conversations and learning together.
If families do have a history of slavery in their ancestry, I always recommend that before trying to do any research, that you read histories of slavery in the US. That is not well taught in schools, so most people know much less than they think they do about the system of Southern slavery. So beginners' resources, really the first thing would be reading actual histories of slavery, so that you know what is myth in our culture and what is actually, standard history of slavery as written about over so many years. My next suggestion would be resources from African-American genealogists and genealogical organizations. If you go, for example, onto the Family Search Roots Tech website, they have many wonderful presentations from genealogists about how to approach African-American genealogy and history, and how to do some of the work between families. Can descendants of enslaved people and their enslavers work together? The answer is yes. That's happening in many families and resulting in many wonderful efforts to reconcile and to work together to build a genealogical record.
Thank you, Amy. And the last thing is, are there any other resources you would point to folks, again, about sharing this history just with the general audience? So folks who may not have learned about it in the past. Obviously, I'll put in one more plug for your book. The link is in the chat there. Your Facebook page, Slavery in Zion. Anything else you would share for folks who want to learn more or have something that's easily shareable about this history in Utah specifically?
The first thing that comes to mind, of course, is Molly Bonner's recent movie about Green Flake. That's a good introduction to the history. If you're in Utah, in Salt Lake City, I suggest going up to the This Is a Place monument and seeing that new Black Pioneers monument. Just things like that are very opening to learning and understanding that there's more of a story here than we would have thought.
Thank you, Amy. I know we're a little bit past the hour, but we've had one more question come in that I wanted to throw your way before we end today. This is a question about resources and in your research process. Someone is asking, what did you find was the most useful resource as you've been trying to find information about individuals who often are, omitted, misnamed, forgotten in these records you cited? So.
This is where I would say thank you so much to all of the historians and archivists who spend so much time making records available and putting them online. The census records, something as simple as the census, reading through those can be so useful in figuring out who was actually there and who was not there. But then all the archival records, reading through the Brigham Young collection for all the applicable years, just finding letter collections that might reference enslaved people. So archival records, genealogical records, I can't emphasize the importance of having genealogical skills enough when trying to do this kind of research, historical research. It really takes putting the two kinds of skill sets together, historical and genealogical, to be able to tell these kinds of stories.
Thank you again so much, Amy. We've had many comments come in thanking you for your thoughtful research, thanking you for your presentation and the effort that you've taken to compile this and make this available to those of us who want to learn more. Again, as a reminder, this will be recorded, or this is recorded, and this discussion will be available on the YouTube page of the Utah Historical Society in the coming weeks. Amy, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us. We really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. It's been a wonderful opportunity to talk about these stories.